Hello and welcome to Rough Cut, your community-driven podcast on navigating the art and practice of video journalism and nonfiction filmmaking from the Vecchio Consortium. I'm Michael Werner, a filmmaker and director of photography, and your host for this episode. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Ondi Timoner, the acclaimed two-time Sundance Grand Jury Prize-winning director, known for her powerful and intimate storytelling. Over her remarkable career, Ondi has given us groundbreaking documentaries like Dig and We Live in Public, which both earned her the distinction of being the only director to win Sundance's top documentary prize twice. More recently, she's turned her lens toward deeply personal subjects, with films like Last Flight Home, chronicling her father's end-of-life journey, and All God's Children, which I had the privilege of working on and which explores the intersection of faith and social justice. Today, we'll explore the delicate art of making documentaries about one's own family, the unique challenges, ethical considerations, and emotional terrain filmmakers must navigate when their subjects are also their loved ones. Let's get into it. Ondi, so you've made a lot of documentaries over the years and on a wide range of subjects, but your recent films, All God's Children and Last Flight Home, are especially personal. For those who haven't seen them, could you just briefly describe them and then tell us what drew you to tell these personal stories?
With Last Flight Home, which is about the last weeks of my father's life, I have been working on a scripted film about my father and the airline that he created and the stroke that caused him to lose it all, which was an accidental stroke caused by his neck being cracked at only 53 years old. Really have been working on a script about that for now over a decade, but by then about 8 years. And I had no intention of making a documentary about Dad because he was really bound to a chair for most of the time, and I just didn't think people would want to see a man sitting in a chair. But also there was like 15 minutes of archival footage total, so it just didn't make sense. But when he suddenly told us that he needed to leave this earth and he needed to go and be freed from his body, and he asked if he could do medical aid in dying, I panicked that I'd forget anything that he said, everything that he said, because I can't remember him from before the stroke because I was only 9 when that happened. And I also just felt like if he left this earth feeling like a failure, then I didn't know if I would be able to go on. I asked him if I could film him when he came home. And his answer was, I instinctively know you're on the right track, which was really interesting because I didn't know what track I was on almost the entire time. You know, like when my sister Rachel, who's a rabbi, came out and started meeting with Dad, she was very much not into cameras. And at this point, I had been filming All God's Children for a couple of years. But there was always tension around it because it was almost like the camera and the documentary process were just very inconveniencing, and they were almost seen as like taking time and attention away from the real work of what she does. And she's very dedicated rabbi and social justice advocate, and that's really what All God's Children is about. All God's Children is about her temple congregation, Beth Elohim, and its partnership with this Black Baptist church that is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, in Brooklyn and neighboring. So, her temple's in Park Slope and this church is in Bed-Stuy. And it's about the partnership that she proposes between her congregation and this Black Baptist church to try to get to know each other, to become family, to try to quell centuries old, tension between the communities. Because I always make these films about, I call them impossible visionaries, and they're like people who take on the impossible and then they also kind of act impossibly, because they can see what we can't.
Well, this Last Flight Home, I mean, it's so personal. I mean, both of these films obviously are personal. You have connections to both of them, but Last Flight Home especially so personal and such tender moments, but raw moments as well. And I'm curious about when you're making a documentary about one's own family with, that has these, unique emotional and ethical challenges. What were some of those big challenges that you faced in making Last Flight Home and All God's Children, and how did you navigate those?
Got to tell you, it's very helpful having a rabbi in the family, because she really guided all of us. And my wife has commented on this, that like a lot of times things like this will draw people apart, but this actually brought us together more even than, we just were there for each other. Nobody was blaming anybody for anything. So there weren't those kinds of challenges during the film. It was just that, as Rachel says in Q&As and stuff, like she didn't know that there was going to be a film. Like everybody just thought Ondi was being Ondi. I film everything all the time. And she was like, this is how Ondi's dealing. And she just forgot about the cameras. Then when his chosen date of passing came and he followed through and it was time to do a memorial, we scheduled a Zoom memorial for COVID because we were in COVID. And it was March 21st, actually, I'm just realizing. And so that was really, really soon after he died. And so I did the Shiva. And then I reluctantly went over and turned on the hard drives because she said, well, you have footage, edit something, So I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm opening this footage right now, but I opened it up and lo and behold, there was Dad alive still inside the Avid, and I could sit there and be with him. And now he's where he wants to be and I can just be with him. It was such a unique gift to be able to grieve with all of his wisdom and humor. He was so sharp and funny, and just experience it actually as if it was the first time, because I was in so much shock and I was so concerned with his well-being and, that I couldn't really experience the what was happening in the room in the same way that I could when I knew that he was at peace. And so I'm supposed to cut a 5-minute memorial video, and the night before I turned in a 32-minute memorial video. And Rachel was not happy about that. Not happy about that. She was like, Dad asked me to do a memorial, and I set up this whole memorial, and now it's a film screening. She said, oh, this is very beautiful, but it should remain sacred. It should remain private. It's sacred and should remain private. That's what she said.
Obviously, I can understand why Rachel would say that. I mean, it's so personal. I mean, both of these films, there's a lot of really personal, intimate moments. Did you have to, at any point, whether it was during the filming or during the editing or maybe even after they've come out, did you have to set boundaries for, for your relationship with them, or just any kind of boundaries so that you felt like you could tell the most honest story possible?
Certainly, Rachel came back and said, I have some notes on Last Flight Home. And I was like, what could you have, And they were so reasonable. They were so sweet, but they were like interesting. Because like one of them was, I just don't want to come off like his rabbi. I'm his daughter, and I want the emotion that I felt to be more visible and evident. So when it came time to All God's Children, she's like, and by the way, in order to feel comfortable, she said, everybody, on the church side is going to sign on to this, and I have to be responsible for their image. So I'm going to need creative say on this, final say. And I thought, well, she's so reasonable with Last Flight Home, it's going to be fine. And I think I was in Istanbul, actually, when the notes came through. She's like, great film, amazing job. Here's my notes. And there were so many. And the movie, like we had no money, and so it was like, not only am I so not ready to work on this anymore, but also what money are we going to work? Like, when is this happening? So it was definitely tense. And I was just super bummed out. I remember I was in Istanbul and I was bummed out because I just didn't want to fight with Rachel, but I did have to set boundaries of like, look, we have no money. We're going to do what we need to do here, but we can't do all of these. So I just want to manage your expectations, go back, look at the list, and let's talk when I get back. And so we talked when I got back, and we actually, it was tense at first. And then it was like, she'd looked at the list and she's like, explained why she needed certain things rewritten. And then probably I called you and asked you to go over there and film her, because I needed you to film her because I wasn't in New York and she needed changes. And then she needed, and then I needed changes because she voiced so much of the story and I wanted the Reverend to be equal, if not greater, in the telling. And so we had to do a lot of sessions with both of them. So it was definitely one of the most challenging films I've ever made, for a number of reasons.
Are there other reasons that you want to talk about, that challenges you had to navigate in the making of this?
Yeah, I will say also Rachel got a lot easier on the camera stuff after Last Flight Home. So thank you, Dad, for that. But even yet and still, the challenges were, this is my sister. I want to make sure that her reputation's intact. I want to do right by her. This partnership is not going well between the church and the temple. Sometimes I felt like a marriage counselor, honestly, because I'd received calls from her, then calls with Rev. It makes for a good movie. It's very dramatic, but this, it's funny when she says in that first meeting, I'm not interested in a kumbaya moment. I mean, that's nice. And at first you feel like it might be a kumbaya adventure with this film, and it's really nothing like that at all. But it also was like the work that they were doing with legislation came to pass, and that provided us with a model that people can follow now. So even on our website, there's a discussion guide that people can download so that they can try to have partnerships in their own community between groups that don't talk, because we're just so polarized at this point as a world. It's very much the right time for this film.
Yeah, absolutely. Really incredible film for these times. I think another question I have about this is, when you're making a film about loved ones, about family, there's personal relationships at stake. You talk about with Rachel, there's reputational things at stake. How much creative input do you think families should have? How much creative input did they have in these films, if any?
They didn't. I mean, my mom didn't ask for anything. Maybe she asked for, I don't think my mom asked for anything. I don't think my brother asked for anything. He's like, if I knew you were making a film, I might have changed my shirt, because he wore the same shirt every day. My mom is like, I would have put on something besides a muumuu and maybe had my hair out of the rollers. Like, they just had no idea a film was happening. And so the thumbnail on Amazon is my mom sitting there in rollers, but that's what it is. It's an intimate film. My sister was the only one who wanted any changes. And like I said, they were very reasonable. And the changes for All God's Children were really about accuracy and portrayal of Hasidic Jews, and making sure that it wasn't offending people unnecessarily, or, that at least it was balanced, even if it was going to offend, and that historically, that it was accurate. So there wasn't, anything that was there, anything I didn't want to do, I pushed back on. Anything I couldn't do, she said, okay. It's very atypical for anyone to have a say in the final cut of a movie. But I did understand in this particular case. And the reality is, I'm not going to put something out that she's going to hate, like this, just way more important. Our relationship is way more important than a movie,
I guess I'm curious too. I mean, I think there are scenes in some of these films maybe where people, like you said, whether it's like clothing choices or whatnot, where people maybe feel like, they're not always portrayed in the most flattering ways, or there's really honest moments that happen in these films that are just, it's real. Like it didn't feel like you're hiding things or pulling things back from the audience. Did you feel an extra weight with responsibility and, how you deal with this, or is it just something, I mean, you obviously, have a lot of films that you've worked on where you're dealing with, difficult moments or raw moments. Is it the same as a film like Dig, or is it different when you're working with family?
No, I feel like the thing about me is I'm kind of the same in any scenario. Like if you put me on stage, I'm the same as if I am talking to you right now, or if you were sitting here on the couch, And I think I have the same approach, like kind of with my films. I always try to portray things accurately, but also from a position of, I'm always thinking of the audience more than anybody. And like, I don't want them to get bored. And I also don't want them to, I don't want to lead them too much. I want them to be able to come to their own conclusion. So I'm always presenting all the sides of the prism. I always, even since my first movie, have always wanted to position the audience as the jury. So yeah, I never felt that way, and I don't feel that way. But I do think that what was happening before I made Last Flight Home actually was I was getting this point in my life where I felt like I'd spent like nearly 30 years, if not 30 years at that point. Because I started making movies in like 1992. So yeah, how many years is that? 33? Yeah. So 29 years in, and I had not made anything about my family, and here was the script I've been working on, obviously, about my dad, but my family's story is pretty incredible. And so are most family stories, and so are most people's stories if they're told well, I think. But yeah, it's what we know the best, right? Like, you couldn't make the movie without having been in the family. In the case of Last Flight Home, we could have made All God's Children without having been in the family, but it helps that I was able to be right there from the beginning of that partnership. And I actually spent more time with the Reverend than I did with Rachel, because I really wanted to make sure that he felt safe with me and they felt safe with me. So I'm just happy that everyone loves the movie on both sides of the partnership. And that's a hard rope to walk. I really feel very blessed that that's the case.
Would you consider doing other personal stories like this, knowing the challenges that are inherent in these?
Yeah, I was planning to make a movie about my son, um, because he was the most well documented person ever. But all of the archives burned, all of the tapes on him just burned, and so I don't have that anymore. So I don't know that I can. I think there's some stuff from the cloud, which I've never loved the cloud more. But yeah, I was planning that. And then obviously this scripted version of Last Flight Home, I'm planning to do as well. And I wouldn't, this fire documentary is very personal. And I'm actually making it with my nephew, who Eli Owen Timoner, who moved out to LA again to work on it with me. So, and his house burned down. So, because my house burned, and then my brother's house burned down, which is just the one you see in Last Flight Home, which is just a mile south of my house. Actually, in between our houses, there's thousands of structures that burned. My producer's house burned down across town too. Like, the whole town burned down. So my best friend's house burned down in the Palisades, and then my wife's father's house burned down in Malibu. So it's not hard to find people whose houses burned down.
I'm
Yeah.
so sorry.
So yeah, I am making another personal film.
So for filmmakers out there, I think there's going to be a lot of people in the audience who are interested in making projects about their family or their loved ones or friends. What's the most important piece of advice you'd give them, people who are looking to do their own film about loved ones and family?
My advice is to film your family, and especially if anybody's in a health crisis or anything like that. Like, I think maybe we have to go through life just pretending like we'll be here forever in order to go on. But the reality, as we know, is that we're all mortal and nothing lasts forever. And so it has been so valuable to our family that I filmed that stuff, and even any videos now that our houses have burned down that I did preserve are so valuable. Like, my brother and his family, we all gathered around and watched this Christmas video I had from, that happened to be at my mom's and wasn't destroyed. And it was like watching gold. You think things are going to last, or times are going to last, or kids are going to be young, and they're not. They change. Everything changes so fast, and time goes on. And this footage is very valuable. And I've even said to people who are like struggling with a dying parent, like just record, even if it feels so exploitative or inappropriate. I mean, I went to see a psychologist because I was worried that it was inappropriate for me to film my dad when he came home from hospice. And she could have told me that it would have been, and I would have just not done it probably. But she said, I thought she'd say, oh, you don't film people dying. Because, Jewish people, we film like birth, bat mitzvah, birthdays, everything, weddings, but never death. That's not like a thing that you film. And so I fully expected her to say it was inappropriate. And instead she said, if you feel like you should film, you should film. So that's when I called Dad. But I think that advice extends, and I've heard my mom give that advice as well. Like, just get anything you can, any audio recording, any video recording. And yeah, I don't know what other advice to give except take time with it, because even though I went fast, I'm an experienced filmmaker, but take time with it, because you'll go through phases where you're coming from a very personal, emotional place, and then you're becoming more of a filmmaker or more of an outside perspective. And that's really important and vital to the final product,
Are there moments in this where you have to put down the camera to preserve relationships, or do you just keep filming?
No, I kept filming. I mean, there was that moment where the cameras die because the film was never the point. We were with Dad on that last day, the celebration of life on March 2nd, when Gigi, he calls Gigi his granddaughter to his bedside. That's only at first on a surveillance camera that I had put up because I was like, I don't want to worry about this. I don't want to have to keep track of the tapes or the media, I don't want to have to do media management. And I don't really have a crew because obviously I'm in my parents' living room. My dad's dying. So I'll put this Nest camera up here, and that way I can record 24/7, and I'll be able to tell what happened first, second, and third. Yeah. So thankfully for the Nest, we had that moment. And then I ran and got a battery and got cameras back up. So no, quite the opposite. It was more like, how do we keep the cameras going? And more like, actually, as the date of Dad's death neared, we'd find my brother behind the camera and stuff. If one of his kids was by the bed, so the main camera was shooting through a door. There were 4 cameras, and the main camera was through a door, and you couldn't see who was standing behind the camera. You couldn't really see the camera, and that had the 2 mics in it. So whoever sat by the bed would just pick up the lav and put it on. So I found my son back there crying because he was watching his grandparents have this love exchange. I found my brother back there making sure cameras were rolling on his kids, that kind of thing. So yeah, it was the opposite.
Ondi, I realize you have a lot of commitments today. You need to get going, but thank you so much for making the time for this chat. This was fascinating and illuminating, and I think going to be so valuable for our audience to hear.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
This episode of Rough Cut was hosted by me, Michael Werner, and produced by Audrey Horwitz, and executive produced by Dylan-Robbins and Kat Vecchio. Our original music is by Zach Wright.
Rough Cut is part of the Vecchio Consortium, which is a global creative community and organization that supports the world's nonfiction filmmakers and video journalists to tell bold stories that catalyze change. We would love for you to join our nonfiction film family, and you can learn more at videoconsortium.org.
And we love hearing from listeners. So if you would like to send us a note, you can find us on Instagram at Rough Cut Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@videoconsortium.org. And don't forget to rate us and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe. Thank you, and see you soon.